Hello, it's me, a bearded white man on the internet with a lot of unearned confidence talking about his nerdy obsessions. What a refreshing change of pace this will be. So a lot of people are mad at D&D right now, huh? For the record, I started planning this channel where I discuss playing games other than D&D before Wizards of the Coast decided to eat itself. I'm not psychic and I haven't been feeding them terrible business advice as a marketing ploy, it's just a coincidence. And the OGL isn't something I have a particular expertise on, so I won't be commenting on it other than to say that I'm really glad I didn't spend the last 6 months planning a D&D show. Dodged a bullet there. If you're not familiar with how Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast are turning against their fans, there are people much smarter and more invested in that story than I am who have made plenty of videos on the subject. And if you do a quick search in the box above, I'm sure you will find all the info you need. Suffice to say, I think that everything they've done with the new OGL is bad, and even if you don't quite understand why it's bad for creatives when it doesn't affect your home game, you have to see that the absolute PR nightmare they have created by failing to respond in a meaningful way is a massive blunder. But it's an evolving story and anything I say could be out of date almost immediately, so this is as much as I'm going to discuss it. See my Twitter for other thoughts, but fair warning, my Twitter thoughts are often a lot less edited than this carefully written video. Anyway, I put a poll in the community tab a couple of weeks ago to see what I should cover on this channel next, so we're here to talk about how to unlearn D&D, because that won. It's possible it won because of the controversy, but again, just a coincidence if you can believe that. I'm not making this video to stick it to Wizards of the Coast, in light of them trying to screw over their fan base. I generally think the only thing D&D is really good at is marketing, and a lot of people would find themselves happier playing something else, or at least playing other games as well. Broaden your horizons. If you've seen my other videos, you may have gotten the hint that I don't think D&D is very good, mostly because I don't think D&D is very good. It's not bad, it's just, fine. Does it weird me out that it has hundreds of pages of material made for it every year, along with mountains of tertiary products, numerous web series, conventions, and even D&D themed holidays, some of which cost an exploitative amount of money? A little, but as a game it's fine. I get why people want to play it, and it's kind of the granddaddy of the genre, so I guess it deserves respect. It's sort of like comic book movies for me. I like the Marvel movies as much as the average nerd. I own all the DVDs up until Endgame, even the ones I actually don't like out of some weird sense of loyalty. But if someone told me a Marvel movie was the best movie they'd seen all year, all that would really tell me is that they didn't watch as many movies as I did that year. And I have run a lot of tabletop role-playing games, and more importantly, I prefer running non-D&D systems, and often end up having to teach these systems to D&D players. As a result, I have some experience of the bad habits that D&D instills in its players, and the expectations they end up with because of that game. And a lot of what makes D&D good simply doesn't translate to other games. But I would also argue that a lot of what makes D&D good for the players makes D&D kind of boring for the DM. I think running D&D can sometimes feel less like an exciting adventure and more like being an accountant who has to follow the fellowship around and explain why they can't seduce the Balrog no matter how hard they try. Also, I'm going to be using D&D as a catch-all term to some degree. I'm referring specifically to 5e as that's what I play, but you can likely extrapolate a lot of what I'm saying to other editions and also to other D20 systems. I'll also be using DM and GM as interchangeable terms. It's the person running the game, whatever that game may be. Everything I'm about to say is intended to help people detach themselves from the vampiric bite of D&D, but if you want to take these points and incorporate them into your D&D to try and get a little magic back, go for it. All I can tell you is how I like to run games and what I've observed. Anyway, let's start with a practical talking point, as it does need stating. Gaming is not expensive. Okay, gaming is expensive, but that's because most any hobby is, unless you're one of those weirdos who likes to jog in the park or something, and I bet even they have to buy shoes or belts. I don't know, I don't do a lot of exercise. However, D&D feels like a bit of a grift, something that a lot of players seem to have only recently learned. Because a lot of D&D players didn't realise that the hundreds of pounds worth of books they haven't fully read, minis they barely use, terrain they use even less, and dice they obsessively collect might have been more interested in taking their money than improving their hobby. Shock. Okay, before you all jump on me in the comments, I'm a nerd and a collector. I appreciate the completionist desire to own stuff just because you think it's cool. And I've definitely spent money on things I don't really need within the hobby. It's okay, Cthulhu, no one is judging you here. I have the anniversary edition of Ticket to Ride, for example, and if I had the cash, I would have bought that ludicrously overpriced deluxe edition of Small World because it's one of my favourite board games of all time. So unnecessary, but so cool. The point I want to make here is that compared to D&D, a lot of games only require you to buy one singular book, sometimes at a fraction of the price of any given D&D tome, and these games can provide just as much game time as D&D. That's not to say that other games haven't expanded into a ludicrous array of additional material. I mean, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that I started my game largely in Rifts, a system that is by no means a stranger to being an overwritten mess. But a lot of games understand that players only need a fairly small amount of information to get to the grit of role-playing, particularly if they favour a more performance-led roleplay style like Critical Role. So when those games release an expansion, the intention is to give the players a genuinely new experience. Say what you like about Rifts, but each world book is practically an entire game in itself, with a massive selection of character options and lore. But it is a mess. It's a mess of a game. Plus, miniatures, maps, and even excessive dice expenditures are a fairly uniquely D&D thing. If you're telling me you're happy to buy 5 sets of dice and a new mini every month, but don't want to drop 30 quid on an alternative games rulebook because you're not sure when you'll play it, I find that very bizarre. And at the very least, it's a book you can read. Perhaps the best way to handle this is with a mini-campaign. Maybe your D&D game just ended, or you're still trying to put one together and you have a less consistent group that could meet up in the meantime. Well, then grab another game off the shelf and give it a try, even if it's just a one-shot game. And if nothing else, you've got a book full of ideas that you can reference for your upcoming D&D game. Maybe there's something in there that you think would make a good house rule. For example, I was given Fate of Cthulhu for Christmas, and the way its turn order works is once each player has finished their turn, they get to decide who goes next for that round. This means that players can coordinate their actions to best utilise each other's abilities. You don't need to hold your action if you think there will be a better opportunity to use it, you can just act later in the turn order for the round. Obviously your first thought is to make the bad guys go last, right? Sure, but that means that for the next round, since the GM went last, they get to choose who goes first. So why wouldn't they pick the bad guys again and give the bad guys 2 turns in a row? And if there's multiple villains, that could be very problematic for the players. I haven't played it yet, so I don't know how well it works, but I was immediately intrigued by the concept and the possibilities for strategic play that it could open up. So yeah, if another system intrigues you, buy it instead of whatever mediocre module WotC just put out. You can do anything. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, or it's easier to make saving throws than wait for ability checks. Or something. The biggest hurdle I see when teaching D&D players other systems is that they don't realise how restricted they are by D&D and how timid that game has made them. I'm not sure why this is, but my guess would be how the game has programmed them to think of the DM as an authority figure rather than a fellow player. And as superficial as it is, I think the DM screen is a big part of that. D&D is the only game I run with a screen, and the only reason I do that is in case I get a ruling wrong and have to fudge things so as not to ruin the game, which I might think is the only reason to have a screen at all. I mean, you could say it's to hide your notes, but who's trying to read notes from across the table? I can't read notes from across the table. Why would somebody else be trying to figure that one out? Without the game telling them what they're allowed to do, the average D&D player often has no idea what to do, even though they can do literally anything. Which is weird, because in my experience D&D players are always trying to find alternative uses for their abilities, joyfully thinking outside the box and trying to problem solve in unique ways. That's all less restrictive systems are asking you to do. You just no longer have the safety net of the tight rule set, something that if you think about it you probably didn't need anyway. Of course, sitting at the table and saying do anything to your players is unhelpful unless your goal is to get a bunch of blank stares back at you, but convincing players that there's more to the hobby than rolling dice until you get the right numbers is key to expanding beyond D&D. And honestly, for the character-driven, performance-heavy style of gameplay popularised by actual play shows, D&D is in many ways one of the worst systems. And regardless of how abstract the system, you can never truly do anything. The game will still have an internal logic to it that you have to obey. Just because it's not firmly written down doesn't mean it isn't there, but a more abstracted system will allow more creative bending of those rules, or even encourage it. The problem is that D&D players are so used to being told no. Being told no is something D&D players have internalised as okay, and no matter how creative your table is, the game has fairly comprehensive rules, so you might have to say no less than some DMs, but you will still say it. Luckily, this is easily fixed. Never say no to your players. And yes, that is very stupid advice. I don't mean allow your players to do whatever they want all the time, I mean allow your players to attempt whatever they want all the time. And if you want to rule that that was never going to work, that's fine, but don't just say it doesn't work, give them consequences for it not working. If it was a questionable idea, have it complicate the situation. Saying no is boring, complicating your players' lives because of their bad decisions is way more interesting. And let's be honest, if your player was foolish enough to think it might work, then their character probably was as well. If anything, saying no is giving them an unfair advantage. You're giving them meta-knowledge that allows them to strategize outside the logic of the game, particularly in a combat situation where in-game they've only really got 6 seconds to figure out what they're going to be doing. This will work to reward creative thinking more often, but you'll need to be flexible. D&D has rules, and those rules rarely account for every possibility. So if your players do something interesting that is technically, mechanically pointless, but only you really know that, you might have to adjust the scene so that what they're doing actually does work. You only have to do this if the players prompt it, but once you've done it once, it will instill in them the idea that creative solutions can be more effective than just hitting the thing, and that will absolutely serve them better in other games where the rules to hit the thing are lighter or non-existent, and creativity is actively rewarded. I feel like I'm being uncharitable to D&D players here, so let's look at it another way. Creativity in D&D comes from figuring out how to manipulate the rules to your advantage. And there's a lot of creative thinking in that, but other more rules-light systems, which is most systems, are a little more demanding. Figuring out a creative solution to a mechanical problem in D&D feels special, like you outsmarted the game, but being forced to think of a creative solution in a more abstracted rule set can be intimidating. And some people just don't like that. Some people are chess players, not charades. Is charades the opposite of chess? When I teach Fate, my favourite system, I like to try and instill in the players that the biggest difference is that they should never ask if they can use a skill. They should tell me what they're trying to do and what skill they're using to do it. There obviously has to be some logic, but some characters will use different skills to do the same thing. A very stealthy character might use their stealth to get across a crowded room undetected, but maybe nobody else has good stealth, so the next character uses deception to walk across the room as if they were supposed to be there. Perhaps the next uses their acrobatics to climb around the room, avoiding contact with anyone, and the last uses their perception to wait for a moment when everyone is looking away and just bolts across. The goal is clear and each player can perform the task, but the players are free to use their strengths to explain how they achieve it instead of everyone just being asked to make a stealth roll. This comes, I think, from D&D players never feeling like they fully know what they are doing. Again, this feeling of the DM as an authority figure who knows better than they do. And whilst the DM has final say on any ruling because eventually someone has to, they don't necessarily have better ideas than you do. There's nothing wrong with saying I'm going to rather than can I. And back to my point about consequences being more interesting than failure, doing something and it not working or it making things worse if it was a really bad idea is better than being told no. You don't have to cheat. Remember that DM screen problem I was talking about? Well, D&D is hard to run. Occasionally you'll under or overestimate an encounter, puzzle or enemy, and on those occasions you'll need to cheat. I don't believe any DM who says they haven't fudged a roll or an encounter. Not every encounter. Sometimes you goof it and your players deserve an easy win, and sometimes your players bite off more than they can chew after ignoring your warnings and they deserve to get their asses kicked. But the somewhat unspoken rule of D&D is that the DM is trying to keep the game fun, and sometimes that means lowering or raising the difficulty on the fly so that the game doesn't grind to a halt unexpectedly. However, D&D is the only game that tries to pretend this isn't happening, and it really stifles the game. Whether they admit it or not, the players know that they are the main characters of this story. They know that the logic of the world and the game is going to bend to their favour, even if it's only a little bit. If they learn that the Lich King is trying to overthrow the elf capital, they know that they are the only ones who can stop them, regardless of how underqualified they are for that task, because they're the protagonists, and if they do nothing, the Lich King will likely take over. Which they might not care about. They're entitled to not engage, but the meta is still there. On the player's side, the acceptable face of cheating is called min-maxing. Min-maxing isn't technically cheating, but it's basically cheating. Finding fun combos is fine, but optimizing for maximum efficiency is boring. That's not to say you shouldn't optimize. D&D is a mechanical game, and your characters are supposed to be good at stuff. If you make a rogue who isn't sneaky, or a wizard who isn't clever, you aren't being creative, you just made a bad character. The issue here is that players think they are fighting against the game, and if they don't fine-tune their abilities, they won't be able to beat it, and that just fundamentally is not how the game works. The game does not have a fixed difficulty, and the stronger you make yourself, the more the DM has to increase the difficulty to match. So really, you're not solving or achieving anything by doing this. To be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with min-maxing. If you want to create a super powerful character, you should absolutely go for it, but the table should be aware that that's what's going on. There should be an agreed upon balance to the game. This mindset is nonsense, and the solution is just to admit that it's nonsense. All the other points I'm about to make are pretty much going to feed into that, so I won't dwell on it anymore. We'll just move on to the dice can't save you. This is my dice box. I own multiple sets of D&D dice. However, this is mostly because I used to run learners games at a board game cafe and I wanted to bring enough dice for all the players. Most of the dice in this box are things I've accumulated over the years from other games or just found in the street. I actually found one of these dice just in the middle of the road. It was just there. This is perhaps the one part of the hobby that I don't really understand, and I'd suggest it's somewhat unique to D&D, as that system is more dice focused than a lot of other games, but I much prefer games where you roll dice sparingly and only when it's interesting. The issue here is that D&D players will often think they haven't done anything if they didn't roll any dice, as if the possibility of random failure is what makes it real. But the possibility of random failure is kind of boring, especially when a bad dice roll results in the failure of something necessary to move the plot forward. And sometimes the DM doesn't realise the mistake they've made until after they've asked for a roll. I'm sure many a DM can relate to asking for an investigation check, the player fluffs it, and you realise that if you don't tell them something anyway, they're going to spend the next 2 hours wandering around the town not knowing where to go next. In addition, when a bad dice roll results in a player failing something, the result can be that the other players try as well until one of them gets it right, or the player asks if they can try again, and other than saying no, if the task isn't time sensitive, there's not a lot of reason the player can't just keep trying until they succeed. I mean, that's how real life works. If I fail to reverse my car into a parking spot on the first try, I don't just abandon it in the middle of the lane and go, well, that's as far as my skill can take me. The pass-fail nature also doesn't make sense when compared to difficulty level. Say the rogue fails to pick a DC 10 lock, but then succeeds at picking a DC 25 lock. How does that work? Granted, the players don't know what the difficulty levels are, but presumably you set them because you wanted the second one to be harder than the first one. And now what? They've picked their way into the weapons vault, but the kitchen pantry outwitted them? Difficulty of the roll is irrelevant at that point because there's no practical difference between making a DC 10 check and a DC 25 check beyond probability. The player just rolled a dice either way. And this will get even worse with the proposed ruling that a natural 20 always succeeds. I get that rolling dice is exciting, it's a gamble, and it can be a useful tool in crafting the story. Unexpected success or failure simply because of a dice roll can create the moments you're all talking about the next day. It was memorable when the bard tried to talk the guards into helping them, rolled a 1 and got arrested instead, or when the wizard was challenged to an arm wrestling match and rolled a 20, causing the table to shift enough to give them an advantage over the barbarian who lost their grip. What I think is worth adapting is the fate concept that the players are supposed to be generally capable of the things they're good at, or in D&D terms, the skills that they're proficient with. The rogue can pick locks, the barbarian can lift the heavy thing, the ranger can track the footprints, and so forth. Abandon the mechanical logic of each class being statistically more likely to be able to do certain things and just have them able to do them. Not all the time, of course, but if there's no ticking clock and the action won't instantly win the game, then maybe determine that sometimes proficiency in a skill or tool equals an automatic success. And if your players still want to roll dice, well, they can, but now the dice roll determines the level of success. Yes, the rogue can pick the lock, the door is now open, but they roll the dice with an assigned DC as before, and the pass-fail determines how positive or negative the result of the actions are. A good roll might just get the job done, no hassle, but a bad roll, maybe a little extra gumption was required than intended, and the noise has alerted a nearby sentry. Or for a very bad roll, perhaps a hitherto unnoticed trap has been triggered and a poison cloud explodes in the rogue's face. The door is open either way, but the roll determines the relative success of the action. This requires you to make your players aware that you are running a more malleable game. Perhaps you had not intended for the door to be trapped, but they rolled a 3 on their lockpicking, so now it is. Some players might be wary of this peek behind the curtain, but really from their perspective it's no different to how it was before. It didn't generally know what the DC of a task was, or what secrets there were around it, and I think knowing that they can expect a degree of success on things their character is uniquely skilled at will feel more special than having other players be better at it out of sheer dumb luck. What I'm saying is that players shouldn't pass or fail on dice rolls alone. What they're doing should count for something. So maybe don't allow frivolous dice rolls at your table. It's okay to be railroaded. D&D players have a pathological fear of railroading, even though most of their games are likely pretty scripted, they just don't realise it. Yes, even you. Your game you're thinking of right now? Yes. If you're unfamiliar with the term, railroading is when a game's story and events are fixed and the players are merely experiencing them without necessarily having the power to change them. It's how most video games work, but for the tabletop I advise you play Paranoia. It's by far the most railroaded game. Each scenario is a literal checklist of events that are largely outside of the PC's control, and the aim of the game is just to survive them. This works great in that game, as it's intended to be comedic, and the players are supposed to feel like powerless expendable pawns in the dystopian society that they're trapped within. It's actually really difficult to imagine the game being played any other way. The problem is that this player desire to avoid being railroaded can fly in the face of logic. People will often accuse Critical Role of being scripted because events within follow a logical progression, but that's just because Matt's a good storyteller. He has an idea of where his story wants to go, but he's prepared to accelerate or slow it down to accommodate the player's whims. Though that being said, I do think Critical Role is a little more railroaded than I personally like to run my games. The acceptable face of railroading is of course coincidence. The player characters just happen to stumble across the Yonti temple 3 days before the ritual to raise a demon god. The players learn of the existence of a conspiracy to drain the world of magic the month before the planetary alignment needed to do so. This is the railroading we generally think is okay, even though it's the most contrived, because it fits our understanding of story structure from books, movies and TV. I don't want to get bogged down in that talking point. I covered it a lot in my previous video. For my purposes here, we're going to say that all games should have something of a railroad, in that there should be a logical progression of events. The players can manipulate that progression, but the world doesn't pause when the players stop looking at it. And pausing the story to wait for the players to catch up is kind of railroading in its own way. Or at least it's a very artificial way to force the players into the story. So it's important that the story continues moving at its own pace, because in addition, the number one question of any D&D game, or indeed any game, is when can we play? If you're concerned about when and how often you can play, and you've experienced campaigns fizzling out in the past because players' schedules stop lining up, then spending your session wandering around the wilderness with no idea where to go might feel kind of empty. The characters on Critical Role can spend an entire episode simply preparing for what they're going to do in the next episode, because the players know for sure that they are playing next week. In fact, they have to, they're sort of contractually obligated at this point. If you finish a gaming session and realise that all you did was talk to a shopkeeper and walk around the city trying to find an inn, and you don't know when you're next going to be able to play, it might leave a bad taste in your mouth. What I'm driving at here is if the characters in your game have a goal, don't waste time getting to it. It's okay to skip to the next relevant scene as long as the players have a say in what that scene should be. The problem with D&D is it's so minutiae heavy that players have to waste time preparing whenever they need to do something important, or they'll feel cheated. Players can actually help with this by railroading themselves a little, that is to say, getting to the point as quickly as possible. If there's something that you want to do, or you know that the group needs to do, feel free to prompt the game to get to that moment. One of the unique elements of D&D is how slow its pacing is. It's part of the immersion of the game, sure, but each scene takes place almost immediately after the other, and it would be unusual to finish a quest and then cut to a week later on the other side of the continent. But if you want to get to something, you should feel free to voice that opinion, and you might find the rest of the table agrees. This could result in your group finding the pacing it's comfortable with. I've seen videos discussing how to make things like travel more interesting, but if travel doesn't work for you, maybe just don't bother with it. Other games don't require that kind of minutiae because it's not that interesting. And to the GMs out there, maybe at the beginning of each game, try asking the players what they want to achieve before the end of the session. They may have obvious long-term goals like defeat the Lich King, but presuming that isn't on the cards for the current session, it could be good for them to remind themselves what their short-term goals are, even if that goal is just figuring out how to defeat the Lich King. And with any luck, the question will organically open the session with them having an in-character discussion about what the hell they are doing. You could alternatively ask at the end of each session what players want to prepare to do the next session, so you have time to plan that way, but they might change their minds or just forget by the next time you play, so I actually think that's less helpful. That being said, if the players have an idea what they want to do in the next session, telling the DM is very helpful, please do that. The GM isn't omniscient, and doesn't need to be. D&D puts an unnecessary amount of pressure on the DM. In fact, I would argue that D&D is one of the least fun games to run because of that. You're expected to be up to date and fully informed and extremely knowledgeable about the world you are playing in, to the point of knowing and being prepared for things, most of which will never even come up. A better way of looking at the game is that the GM is a player as well, and the world is their character. Like the players, they are free to do whatever they want, but are not restricted by the logical limitations of only controlling a single person. You should acknowledge that the GM is constantly playing a reactionary game to your actions, building the world to help or hinder you as need be, and they don't need to know what's around every corner. Funnily enough, when I was writing this, I realised something that helped me codify this mindset is blood on the clock tower. I became the London rep for this game back in 2019, receiving an advance copy and running literally thousands of games around London, and then online during the lockdown. I created the London Discord server for the game, and at one point we were likely the busiest server, practically running multiple games a day. I'll probably talk about that in more detail in a more relevant video, but in short, it's a werewolf-style social deduction game where some of the players are evil trying to kill everyone, but most are good trying to figure out who the evil ones are, whilst one player is the adjudicator, or in this case the storyteller. But rather than being a simple arbiter of the rules, as in say werewolf, the player in charge has their own goal, which really is to ensure that everyone has as much fun as possible. They are attempting to balance and manipulate the game to have it go on as long as possible. They want it to come down to the last few players battling it out for the triumph of good over evil, with everyone desperately trying to piece together the well-paced clues to determine who the villains are. And this is how we should view dungeon masters. They aren't here to win or lose or even tell a coherent story. They're here to ensure everyone has fun, including themselves. They are effectively neutral. But if the players look like they would enjoy overthrowing the villain and saving the land, that's what they will aim for. It's nice to think that you've outsmarted a carefully constructed plot and beat the DM, but sorry to break the illusion, you never have. Truthfully, the DM is on your side. If it's clear you would like to win through violence, they're going to help you try and do that. But if you don't want to resolve your problems by hitting them, they should offer other solutions. They don't have to make it easy for you, but there's a reason the Lich King didn't summon 50 undead giants to protect his castle, and instead decided on summoning only the party level appropriate challenge of 3 or 4. Everyone at the table knows that the players are supposed to win, and we're happy to suspend our disbelief to achieve that, even if we don't say it out loud. Also, your DM is not trying to beat you, because at the end of the day, that's a contest you can't win. The DM can do literally anything. They control the world. If they wanted you dead, you'd be dead. They are trying to make sure that you enjoy the game, so players don't be afraid to tell the DM what you want. They will likely work to give it to you. Acknowledging that your DM is balancing things in your favour won't ruin your immersion, so voicing out loud what you'd like to get out of a scene is perfectly okay. The DM isn't under no obligation to give that to you, but if they don't know what it is you're trying to do, they can't help. Trust me, if the DM knows in advance why you have chosen to sneak into the palace, or why you want to go to the Temple of Light, they can work the scene to accommodate or complicate those goals, and the game will be more interesting as a result. This can be as simple as stating that you want to go shopping because you want to boost your armour class. In their head, the DM can now prepare a blacksmith or magic shop that might stock or be able to make something for you. I've run shopping where the players just wanted to see what was available, and honestly, that's very annoying. Sure, I can just roll some random stuff in the DMG, but tell me what you want. What would make you happy? I'll work to give it to you. I want you to have fun. And if you feel things are getting too easy and you want more of a challenge, say that. Again, the DM wants you to have fun, and if ramping up the difficulty level will do that, they will. And DMs shouldn't be afraid of these comments. It's not a criticism, but players don't have to be blatant about it. If you're a table that is comfortable having long in-character conversations, then you can discuss out loud how things have been feeling a little easy lately, and how you think it would be fun to seek out a tougher challenge. DMs can have an NPC even ask them these questions. The only reason not to have these conversations is out of some foolish sense that it will break the immersion of the game. Unless you are in character from the moment you sit at the table to the moment you leave, which not even the critical rolecast are, you aren't really that concerned about immersion. Consider your DM a fellow player, just with a larger toolset than you have, and play the game with them, not at them. And from a practical standpoint, maybe just ditch the DM screen. Take down the barrier between you and the other players and just admit that occasionally you're going to fudge things to make them more interesting. Players don't need to know the rules. Every Halloween the conversation turns to how to run horror in D&D, because D&D is fundamentally bad at horror. It's a power fantasy game. The player characters are essentially superheroes. It's hard to make them feel vulnerable outside of combat. Not to mention that the traditional villains of the genre are standard cannon fodder. How do you make someone scared of the haunted house when they're aware that they can punch a ghost to death? What a lot of this advice seems to miss though is what's at the core of a horror story, and that's that something you thought was true isn't. You thought ghosts weren't real? Well, here they are. You thought nobody knew what you did last summer? Well, guess again. Or it could be simple as, you thought you were safe? What I'm getting at here with this random aside is that one of the strengths of D&D is its familiarity. Its tropes are well established, and even though the mechanics seem complicated, there's enough internal logic that most of them explain themselves. This is great for cutting through the history lesson, but it's also the reason players get bored quickly and want to experiment with new classes and races and settings, and why Wizards of the Coast know that they can always sell you more things. Truth be told, my players know D&D better than I do. I own the books and I'll often pretend to consult them when I'm stalling for time, but most of the time when my players ask for something, I'll just say yes because I'm not worried it'll overpower them, as I'm making all my shit up as I go along. And one of the reasons I make my shit up is because I want my players to be surprised, because that's more fun. Players not wanting to learn a new system is cited as a hindrance to getting a new game to the table, but I'm here to tell you players, you don't need to learn a new system. Few systems are as intimidating as D&D, and many games you can sit down at the table and learn in their entirety during your session 0. Maybe not another D20 system, but even some of those are infinitely more digestible than D&D. On top of that, some of these games you can start playing without knowing the rules and learn as you go. The thing about D&D is the DM can't be expected to fully understand every character at the table, so you need to comprehend your own little corner of the rules before you can do anything. But a lot of systems have a more abstracted universal rule set that doesn't require each player to learn a unique set of actions and abilities. And here's a big one. For the other systems, you don't even need to have read any kind of book to play. Sure, it helps, but some systems can be explained in session 0 by a good GM, and then the players never need to refer to the book again. Seriously, some games are genuinely that easy to play for the players. One of the rules of Paranoia is that the players are not allowed to have read the rulebook. If the players show knowledge of the rules outside of the game, they can be punished for that in the game. That sounds kind of silly, but it's kind of a silly game, that's the point. Rarely will you be required to have an in-depth understanding of rules and minutiae that D&D requires, so it's a lame excuse to say you don't want to learn a new system. What you're really saying is that you find D&D kind of a slog, and it is. Other systems are way more fun to learn. I had a regular gaming group before the pandemic that played a different TTRPG every few months, rarely playing a game more than a few sessions. You'd be surprised. And at the end of the day, a lot of the core elements of role-playing aren't that different. If you enjoy playing in character and coming up with creative solutions to problems, guess what? That's the whole genre. Every game abides by those principles. The rules don't trump logic. This is my last point, but D&D doesn't make any sense. And we all know that D&D doesn't make any sense because the rule of cool exists. Often the rule of cool isn't so much, let's do a super cool amazing thing, so much as it's, let's do this completely logical thing that seems very plausible, but the rules as written don't allow me. I really don't know where I stand on the rule of cool, because the writer in me wants to be creative, but the strategist in me wants to be rewarded for clever play, and those two things don't go together. I'm a board gamer, and board games have strict rules that the players are trying to optimise the strategy of, and I enjoy doing that. I'm also kind of good at it. D&D combat scratches that same itch. Sometimes a player will ask if they can do something, and there's no logical reason they can't other than that the rules say no. That would be fine if we were playing a board game or a war game, but before this fight the players were dressed as a mariachi band to sneak into the princess's wedding, and they enchanted an ice sculpture of a swan to come to life to cause a distraction, and saying no they can't use a table as a shield seems kind of silly. Even though I think D&D does combat fairly well, I do find it distracting and it feels like we've stopped the game to play something else. And it's easily where the game is most broken. Can you imagine giving players a literal 6 seconds to decide what to do on their turn? Players want to strategize and plan and have conversations mid-combat, but technically you shouldn't let them. The arbitrary time and distance constraints in D&D are bad design, and most people ignore them even if they don't realize they are. If you embrace narrative-style combat without these restrictions, you'll find that actually not a lot has changed. They were probably already being soft on those rules anyway. In addition, because even the average player character is so overpowered, combat becomes the only place any real consequences can happen in D&D. Case in point, you can't assassinate someone in D&D. If a villain has a beloved NPC in their clutches and is holding a knife to their throat, so what? If the NPC has any levels in anything, the knife probably isn't going to especially harm them, and even if it does, stabilising and healing someone is pretty easy. For that threat to work, the players have to lie to themselves about the mechanics of the game. They have to pretend that this is a serious situation, when mechanically it just isn't. The mechanics of D&D actively work against dramatic moments like this. It's rare to be able to instantly kill a character, and they're impossible to impose any kind of lasting consequence upon them. This is actually the biggest hole I think there is in D&D. I'm not going to use specifics, but potential spoilers for Critical Role Campaign 1 and possibly Legends of Vox Machina Season 2, but after an attack by dragons, a major NPC is left badly hurt. The players find them amongst the carnage, barely holding on to life, and it's a powerful reinforcement of how serious the danger really is. But it's also nothing. The NPC is alive, so they're fine, because mechanically that's how the game works. They aren't hurt because there's no such thing as being hurt, and even if there were, the players are level 11 at this point I think, and they have a cleric and a variety of other healing capabilities. They can fix the problem instantaneously without any consequences. They even do heal the NPC through magic, essentially eliminating the threat, but Matt and the cast are treating the game as a performance piece, partly because the show is fairly established at this point, but also you get the impression that was just how they like to play anyway, so they ham it up. They pretend this is a problem, that the NPC is still badly injured and in need of help, even though mechanically they are 100% fine. And if that's the feeling you want to capture in your game, sure, you can fake it, or you could play something else, because even amongst D20 systems, D&D is particularly bad at this. There's such a wide gulf between the combat and the narrative that it almost doesn't make sense them being in the same game. The stakes in D&D games are generally pretty low, particularly in groups who treat death as an excuse to roll up a new character. And even in Critical Role, character death is kind of awkward because it inherently lacks drama when it just happens in the middle of a 2-hour combat. Now, I don't advise introducing injury mechanics to your D&D. I've never found any that work with a game where the players can just sleep away their wounds. But if you think that drama is something your players would enjoy, don't try and force it into your D&D. I mean, if Critical Role can barely make it work, then what chance do you have? Pick up another system and maybe make a few suggestions to your group that this could be fun. There's a good chance you already know whether or not your table would enjoy this particular style of play. Playing a system that doesn't get sucked into the combat dimension like a Final Fantasy game makes D&D players feel like there isn't any combat, which is silly, but it might be easy to think of these as having action scenes rather than combat scenes. Plenty of these games have combat mechanics, of course. Some of them are really good, but the narrative more smoothly flows in and out of combat, and because it's not presented as a separate activity, D&D players find it confusing because there's no clear indication when it starts and stops, and combat mechanics can be incorporated at any point in any scene. The point I've been bouncing around this entire video is that unlearning D&D is about removing the shackles of the game and just letting your imagination run wild. Role-playing is about creative problem solving within a story either being laid out by the GM or being created as you go by the group, and you will quickly find that the mountains of rules that come with D&D do very little to help that process. When looking for a new game to play, the immediate thing I am drawn to is character creation, and that's the best advice I can give. Find a game with a character creation process that intrigues you, because that's the only rules your players really need to be aware of up front, and if you can enthusiastically talk about character creation, you will draw them in as well. D&D requires its players to learn too much, spend too much, obey too much, and is generally just too restricted by a system that looks like it's been designed to cover everything, but really every rule is an invisible wall that prevents the players from going too far. I expect that some of your most memorable moments with the game were when you were the least loyal to the rules, and as much as it irks me that Dimension 20 experiments with D&D to the point that they might as well not be playing D&D, what makes that show great is how much they don't care about being D&D. But you can get that feeling by breaking the logic of the game world without breaking the rules of the game. Creativity and cheating are not the same thing, and as I said in my first video essay, at a certain point of breaking the rules, you might just want to admit that you don't like D&D. So there we have it. Thank you for watching. I hope I covered some interesting points there and maybe had some useful ideas on how to explore the hobby outside of D&D. If you have any thoughts on any of the topics I brought up, or if you think I missed something, please do jump in the comments. I do my best to respond, and maybe some ideas for a follow-up video will spark. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, share this with anyone you think would be interested. I'm going to try and build this channel this year with more regular videos like this, because we'll be launching the actual play channel in the near future, as that's originally what we were working on. See my making of playlist for more information on all the behind the scenes stuff. If you want to support this channel, my social medias will be linked below. Plus we have an Amazon wishlist now with some practical stuff and some fun stuff. I should maybe separate those into two lists at some point. But we also have a Ko-Fi donation page with all donations going to building this studio space. If you want to drop us a little donation there, that would be amazing. Speaking of this space, as we're all currently unsure of our relationship with D&D going forward, we are looking to make games here and talk about games here. So if you're a game creator or an enthusiast or just a designer who'd like to be involved in some way, then drop us an email. Once again, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Check out all my other videos and don't let the Wizards of the Coast grind you down. The end.